The gavel came down like a gunshot. Sarah Lockhart stood in the middle of the Caldwell County courthouse yard under a September sky that should have been beautiful, her wrists not bound but her body frozen as if they were. She had ridden into town that morning, believing she was signing papers for her late father's estate. She had worn her good dress, the dark green wool one with the cream buttons, the one her mother had sewn for her 3 Christmases past. She had braided her auburn hair neatly and pinned it beneath her hat. She had been so certain this was a formality, a closing of books after grief, a final administrative kindness before she could return to the Lockhart homestead and begin the quiet, solitary work of rebuilding. She had not known she was the thing being sold. Lockhart parcel, 160 acres along Sweetwater Creek, plus the dwelling and all contents therein. The auctioneer, a thin man named Purvis with a collar too tight for his red neck, had read from his ledger. Additionally, as collateral named in the original instrument of debt, Miss Sarah Lockhart, spinster, age 26, is hereby offered as indentured labor for a period not to exceed 5 years, or until the sum of $412 is retired in full. The world had tilted. She had grabbed the wooden fence post beside her and felt the splinters bite into her palm, and she had been grateful for that pain, because it was the only real thing in the universe at that moment. The crowd around her had shifted, uncomfortable, a few men looking away, a few looking directly at her with the flat, assessing eyes of men who bought things. $412, Purvis repeated. Do I hear an opening bid? Betrayal was too small a word for what was happening. Her father had been dead 3 months. 3 months, and she had gone through his desk, through his strongbox, through every drawer in the homestead kitchen, and she had found nothing indicating a debt of this magnitude. Nothing indicating any debt. Her father, Franklin Lockhart, had been careful with money to the point of stubbornness. He had paid cash for seed and cash for lumber, and he had refused on principle to use the territorial bank. And yet here she stood. 200, said a voice from her left. She turned and saw Denton Graves, who owned the feed store and had watched her with hungry eyes since she was 17, and the nausea that rose in her was oceanic. 250, came another, a stranger, a man in a brown coat. The bids climbed. Sarah's hands had gone cold. She was calculating. She was a woman of mathematics. She had kept her father's accounts since she was 14. And she was calculating how long it would take her to repay $412 working as a seamstress or a laundress or a schoolteacher if she could find a position. And the answer was 3 years at minimum. 3 years during which time some legal instrument that she had never seen and whose origins she could not begin to explain would bind her to a stranger's household. Her mind went to the darkest places. She had heard stories. Everyone on the frontier had heard stories. 375. The voice that said that came from somewhere behind her and to her right, and it was calm in a way that stood out from the others the way a single clear note stands out from a room full of noise. She turned. He was tall, which she registered first because she registered physical facts before emotional ones. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had been expensive once and was still well-maintained, dark brown with a slight trail dust over the shoulders. His hat was black, pushed back on his head in a way that was either careless or deliberate, and she could not tell which. His jaw was set clean-shaven, and his eyes, when they met hers across the churned-up courthouse yard, were the particular gray-green of river water in October, and they held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds before he looked back at Purvis. $375, he repeated. $380, said Denton Graves, and there was something ugly in how quickly he said it. $412, the tall man said. The full amount of the debt, paid in full, today. Cash. The silence that followed was the kind that is weight. Purvis looked from the tall man to his ledger and back again. Sir, the auction protocol. The debt instrument specifies that if the full sum is tendered prior to the close of auction, the auction ceases and the debt is retired in its entirety. I have read the instrument, Mr. Purvis. I suspect you have too. Am I incorrect? Another silence. Purvis consulted his ledger with the intensity of a man hoping the words would rearrange themselves. "You are not incorrect," Purvis said finally. "Then I will accompany you to your office now and tender payment, in gold." The crowd around Sarah began to disperse with the particular disappointed shuffle of people who had come for a spectacle and were being deprived of it. Denton Graves spat on the ground and walked away without looking at her. The man in the brown coat simply turned and disappeared. Sarah stood still in the courthouse yard as the crowd thinned around her, and she tried to understand what had just happened and what it meant, and whether she had simply traded one trap for another. The tall man was speaking quietly with Purvis, who was leading him toward the courthouse doors. Before he followed Purvis inside, the tall man turned and looked back at her. The distance between them was perhaps 30 feet. "I'll be no more than 20 minutes," he said, and there was no command in it, only information. She stood in the September sun and waited because she had nowhere else to go. Her horse was at the livery. Her homestead, apparently, was no longer hers. Her father's hidden debt had swallowed the only life she had known, and a stranger had purchased her freedom from that debt as casually as another man might buy a horse, and she did not know if she should feel grateful or furious or both at once. She decided in the end to feel both. She crossed her arms over her chest and waited, and in exactly 18 minutes the tall man came back through the courthouse doors, tucking a folded paper into his coat pocket. He came to where she stood and stopped a proper distance away, close enough to speak at a conversational volume, far enough that she did not feel crowded. He took off his hat and held it in both hands, which was either manners or a calculated gesture of non-threat, and again she could not tell which. "My name is Silas Ellsworth," he said. "I own the Doubly Ranch about 12 miles north of here. I'd like to explain to you what just happened if you're willing to listen, and then I'd like to ask you a question." "What question?" she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "What you want to happen next," he said. "Your situation, your choices. I want to hear them from you." She studied him for a long moment. He was perhaps 30, 32 at most. There was nothing threatening in his posture. There was also nothing apologetic in his eyes, which she appreciated because false apology from strangers was its own kind of trap. His expression was simply direct, as if he had decided some time ago that directness was the most efficient policy and had not revisited the decision since. "Then explain," she said. He nodded once. "There's a place down the street that serves coffee. If you'd rather stand here, that's fine too." "Coffee?" she said, because her hands were still cold and she suspected they would be cold for some time. They walked together down the main street of Caldwell, which was called Providence Street, though there was not much about it that felt providential, and he held the door of the Bright Star Eating House open, and they took a table by the window and a woman brought them 2 tin mugs of coffee without being asked, and Sarah wrapped both hands around her mug and let the heat seep into her palms and looked at Silas Ellsworth across the table. "The debt instrument," he said, without preamble. "It was signed 8 years ago. Your father borrowed $412 from a man named Clovis Holt, who ran a private lending operation out of Wichita at the time. The collateral, beyond the land, included a provision that was, and I want to be precise about this, legally questionable at best. But territorial law in 1878 was sufficiently ambiguous that Holt's instrument was never successfully challenged. Holt died 2 years ago. His instruments were purchased as a bundle by a land speculation company called the Meridian Group. They have been quietly acquiring debt instruments across 3 counties and calling them in succession." Sarah set down her coffee. "What is the Meridian Group's interest in 160 acres along Sweetwater Creek?" He looked at her with what she recognized slowly as appreciation. "Water rights," he said. "The creek feeds 4 properties. If they own the Lockhart land, they control the eastern bank. They've already acquired the Hennessy property to the north. They are working methodically." "And you," she said, "what is your interest?" The question hung between them. He did not look away from it. "My eastern pasture borders your land," he said. "I have 40 head that water at Sweetwater Creek. If Meridian controls the eastern bank, they control my water access within a year. That is part of my interest." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a micro-movement around his eyes that she filed away to think about later. "And part of my interest is that what Purvis was conducting this morning was a disgrace, and I had the means to stop it, and I have made a practice of not walking past a disgrace when I have the means to address it." "That is a remarkably high-minded position for a rancher," she said. "I have been called worse things than high-minded," he said. Despite herself, despite everything, she almost smiled. She pressed her lips together instead. "The document in your pocket," she said. "What does it say exactly?" He reached into his coat and produced the folded paper and slid it across the table to her. She unfolded it and read it carefully. It was a receipt for payment in full of the debt instrument, signed by Purvis as court officer, countersigned by the acting territorial court clerk. The debt was retired. The land, however, had already been seized under the auction's preliminary proceeding before the debt was paid. The receipt cleared her of personal obligation but did not automatically restore the land. She read it a second time to be certain she had understood it correctly. "The land," she said, "is a separate matter," he agreed. "It was seized by the court as part of the proceeding. Retiring the debt removes your personal obligation, but the land's restoration requires a separate filing, likely a court petition, possibly contested by Meridian's lawyers, who are better funded than you are at present." Sarah put the receipt down on the table and looked out the window at Providence Street, where a wagon loaded with lumber was passing, and two men on horseback were arguing about something, and the morning continued with its ordinary indifference to the catastrophic. She thought about the homestead, the kitchen with its window that faced east and filled with morning light, the garden her mother had started and she had maintained for 11 years since her mother's death, the creek in the evening when the light went amber and the water sounds changed pitch. "Tell me about the petition," she said. He spent the next 30 minutes telling her about it in clear, organized language, citing the relevant territorial statutes without condescension, outlining the likely timeline, the probable cost, the odds of success with and without legal representation. He had clearly thought about this before this morning, which meant he had known about the auction in advance, which meant there was a history here she had not yet fully mapped. "How long have you known about the Meridian Group's plan?" she asked. 7 weeks, he said. "I learned about it from a land surveyor who works for them and came to me privately. He was uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. And you came to this morning's auction specifically to intervene." "Yes. You could have warned me," she said, and there it was, the edge in her voice that she had been keeping behind her teeth. 7 weeks. You had 7 weeks to come to my door and tell me that my land was about to be seized and that there was apparently a debt instrument against it that I had no knowledge of. 7 weeks, Mr. Ellsworth." He absorbed this without flinching. "You are right," he said, and he said it simply, without qualifications. "I calculated that I could prevent the seizure through other means and that approaching you directly would cause alarm without certainty of relief. I calculated wrong about what would happen this morning. Purvis moved the proceeding up by 2 days. I was not prepared for the personal obligation provision to be exercised in a public auction. I am sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze and did not fill the silence with excuses. "I want my land back," she said. "I know," he said. "And I want to see the original debt instrument, the one my father supposedly signed." "I have a copy," he said. "I can show it to you now if you want." She did want. He produced another document from his inner coat pocket, this one showing more wear, and passed it across the table. She unfolded it and looked at the signature at the bottom and felt something cold move through her chest that was distinct from the earlier nausea, a more specific cold, a more specific horror. The signature was her father's name, Franklin Thomas Lockhart, but the handwriting was not her father's handwriting. She had copied documents in her father's hand for over a decade. She knew every particularity of how he formed his letters, the way his capital L had a distinctive secondary loop, the way his T's were crossed low. The signature on this instrument was a reasonable forgery. It would pass casual inspection, but it was not her father's hand. "This is forged," she said. Silas Ellsworth looked at her with steady eyes. "That is what I believe as well," he said. "Proving it is the challenge." She sat back in her chair, and for a moment the full weight of the morning, the auction, the crowd's eyes on her, Denton Graves' bidding, the forgery, the Meridian Group, all of it, settled across her shoulders like something physical. She was 26 years old, and she had managed a homestead alone for 3 months, and before that for 3 years while her father's health declined. And she was capable, and she was not someone who collapsed under weight, but the weight at this moment was considerable. "I need to think," she said. "I need to think about all of this, and I need to know what my options are. The honest ones, not the ones that look good and aren't." "Then let me tell you what I know and what I can offer," he said. "I know that Meridian has lawyers in Wichita, and that they will fight a petition on the land. I know that a handwriting expert could evaluate the signature, and that there is one in Abilene who has testified in territorial court before. I know that the surveyor who came to me has documentation of Meridian's acquisition strategy that would be relevant to a forgery case. What I can offer is the petition fee and the expert fee and the cost of legal representation, as a loan, no interest, no timeline, until your land is restored, and you have the resources to repay it if you choose to, or to forgive it outright if the court decides against you." The word loan sat between them, and she examined it from all sides. "And what do you want from that arrangement?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Other than what I've already told you, the water access, which is a separate matter entirely and one I can address another way if I have to. People don't loan money with no interest and no timeline out of the goodness of their hearts, Mr. Ellsworth," she said. "Not in this world." "No," he agreed. "Generally they don't. I'm not offering this because I'm good. I'm offering it because I believe your father was defrauded. I believe you were wronged this morning in a public proceeding that I should have been able to prevent. And I have more money than I need, and a neighbor situation that requires someone decent living on that Sweetwater land rather than a land speculation company. Those are my reasons. You can take them or leave them." She looked out the window again. She thought about the homestead's kitchen window and the morning light. "I'll take them," she said, provisionally. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face and then was gone, replaced again by the careful directness that she was beginning to understand was simply his natural register. "Then we should talk to a lawyer," he said. "There's one in Caldwell who handles land matters. His name is Abernathy. He's not brilliant, but he's honest, which in this county is the rarer quality." They finished their coffee. Sarah looked at the receipt from the court and at the forged debt instrument and folded both carefully and put them in her coat pocket, which was a woman's habit, putting important documents inside her coat instead of a bag, a habit her father had taught her. She thought about her father and the forgery and felt a new anger building beneath the fear, a cleaner anger, one she could use. The lawyer's office was 3 buildings down from the eating house, above a hardware store, and they climbed the narrow staircase and found a man named Abernathy who was perhaps 50 and wore spectacles with one cracked lens, and who listened to everything with his hands folded on his desk and his expression unchanging. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The handwriting analysis is your strongest avenue," he said. "If you can prove forgery, the debt instrument is void, the seizure is void, and the land reverts. Meridian will contest. Their lawyers are from Wichita and they have practiced in territorial court before. The case will take, at minimum, 4 months, possibly 9. "And in the meantime?" Sarah asked. "In the meantime, the land is in court limbo. You cannot legally occupy it, but neither can Meridian develop it or sell it. It sits." She thought about that. 4 to 9 months. "Is there accommodation I can arrange in Caldwell?" she asked. Abernathy looked slightly uncomfortable. "Lodging houses are at capacity. The railroad surveyors have taken most rooms through October." Silas Ellsworth said, very carefully and without looking at her, "The Doubly has a foreman's cottage that is not currently occupied. It is a separate structure from the main house. It is decent lodging. The offer stands without conditions." The room was very quiet. Sarah looked at the cracked lens in Abernathy's spectacles and thought about all the ways a woman in her position could be exploited, and all the ways she had already been exploited today, and she thought about the tone of Silas Ellsworth's voice, which was the voice of a man trying very hard to make an offer without making it feel like pressure, and she thought about her kitchen window and the morning light. "I'll look at the cottage," she said. "I make no commitment beyond looking at it." The cottage was small and clean and smelled of cedar, and had a real glass window that faced west across the Doubleys' pasture. There was a wood stove, a rope bed with a decent mattress, a table with 2 chairs, and a shelf with 3 books on it, which was not nothing. Silas showed her through it in about 4 minutes, said the hired cook, a woman named Mrs. Delacroix who had come from New Orleans and ended up on the Kansas frontier by a route she was reluctant to discuss in detail, would provide meals if she wanted them, and then he stepped back to the cottage door and said he would give her time to think. She stood in the cottage's single room for a long time after he left, and she thought about secrets and betrayal, and the dark past that had apparently been gathering itself around her father's name while she was not watching. And she thought about forged signatures and the Meridian Group's patient, predatory accumulation of dead instruments. And she thought about a tall man with river-water eyes who had paid $412 in gold this morning, and then asked her what she wanted. She stayed. She had nowhere else to go, which was the practical reason. But as she lay on the rope bed that night listening to the sounds of a working ranch settling into darkness, the cattle moving in the near pasture, the sound of the cook's fire going out in the main house, the distant yip of coyotes along the creek, she admitted to herself that there was another reason, a more complicated one that she was not yet prepared to name. The next 3 weeks were the kind that change a person without their realizing it is happening until they look back later and see the line of before and after. She spent her mornings with Abernathy in Caldwell, working through the legal documents, learning the specifics of the territorial land code, writing letters to the handwriting expert in Abilene whose name was Dr. George Calvert and who had a practice in document examination. She spent her afternoons differently. She rode the Doubleys' perimeter initially just to have somewhere to go, and discovered that the ranch was larger than she had understood and more complicated. A working operation of 600 head, 4 full-time hands, a seasonal crew that expanded to 15 in the summer, and a system of water management along 3 creek tributaries that Silas had engineered himself over the previous 6 years. She began, without exactly deciding to make herself useful. She had kept her father's accounts. The Doubleys' accounts were being kept in a system that was functional but inefficient, a ledger system that required 3 separate books to cross-reference where one properly organized system would have done the same work. She mentioned this to Silas one evening when they passed each other at the gate of the main house yard, and he looked at her with an expression that was partly surprised and partly something else, and said, "Show me." She showed him. He watched her reorganize the first week's entries into the new system in about 40 minutes, the same work that had previously taken 3 evenings, and he was quiet for a long time after she finished. "I've been doing this wrong for 6 years," he said. "You've been doing it inefficiently for 6 years," she said. "It's different." "How is it different?" "Wrong means the answers are incorrect. Yours are correct. They just take too long to find." He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the newly organized ledger, and then he looked at her again, and there was something in his face that she was beginning to recognize as a kind of internal reordering, a man updating his assessment of a situation with new information. "Would you be willing to take on the accounts while you're here?" he said. "As work, paid work, not charity," she considered. "At the going rate for a bookkeeper," she said. "The going rate for a bookkeeper in this county is about $1 a day," he said. "Then that," she said. "Done," he said. They shook hands on it, which was unusual enough that one of the ranch hands, a broad-faced young man named Tom Causey who had been watching from the corral fence, visibly raised his eyebrows. The paid work changed something. She did not fully understand what it changed until later, but there was a shift in the quality of her presence on the ranch, a shift from uncertain guest to something more grounded, and she noticed that the unease she had been carrying since the courthouse auction, the feeling of being on someone else's territory by their permission and their generosity, eased significantly. She was earning her place. The earning mattered to her in a way that was about more than money. The letter from Dr. Calvert in Abilene arrived in the third week. He would examine the document. His fee was $30 plus travel if required for testimony. He would need the original instrument and at least 3 verified samples of the supposed signatory's handwriting. She had those samples. She had every letter her father had written to the seed company in Topeka, kept in a box in the homestead, which was currently in court limbo. She explained this to Abernathy. The court limbo does not prevent removal of personal property from the structure, Abernathy said. Only sale or development of the land itself is stayed. You can retrieve your belongings. She rode to the homestead alone the following morning, and it was harder than she expected. The garden had gone mostly dormant in the September cool and would need to be prepared for winter, and the sight of it unattended, the basil gone to seed and the tomato cages empty, hit her somewhere below the ribs in a way that surprised her. She went inside and moved quickly through the familiar rooms, taking what she needed, the letters from the seed company, her mother's Bible, 2 dresses and her winter coat, the mathematics books her father had ordered from a bookseller in St. Louis when she was 12. She took the account books she had kept for the homestead, because they documented her father's financial habits, and those habits were relevant to the forgery case. A man as careful and cash-forward as Franklin Lockhart would never have taken a $400 private loan without leaving a trace of it in his own accounting. And there was no trace. She had read those books 3 times now, and there was simply no evidence that the money had ever arrived. She brought everything to Abernathy. He studied the account books for 2 days, and then he sent a letter to Dr. Calvert with the samples and the copies, and they waited. Waiting, she discovered, was something Silas Ellsworth was not naturally good at. He managed it through work, through the constant physical and administrative demands of a 600-head cattle operation, but there was a quality of suppressed movement to him, a sense that he was always on the verge of acting, that he held himself in readiness the way a good horse holds readiness in its muscles even standing still. She watched this without commenting on it for 2 weeks, and then one evening, when they were both at the main house table going over the accounts after supper, she said, "What are you afraid is going to happen?" He looked up from the ledger. "What?" "With the Meridian Group. You're watching for something. What are you afraid they're going to do before the case is resolved?" He set his pencil down. The lamp between them flickered in a draft from the window. "They've done this 14 times in 3 counties," he said. "In 11 of those 14 cases, the contested party withdrew their opposition before the case came to hearing. In 2 more, the cases were decided in Meridian's favor. In 1, the contested party prevailed. What caused the withdrawals?" She asked, though she had a sense of the answer from the weight with which he said it. "Pressure," he said, "of various kinds. Some of it was financial offers to pay the contesting party to drop the case. Some of it was social. One family had a fire. No one was hurt, but their barn and winter feed were lost. One man found that his credit at every supply house in the county had been quietly canceled. None of which is necessarily connected to Meridian." "No," he agreed. "None of which is necessarily connected to Meridian." The lamp flame steadied. Outside the window the prairie dark was complete, and the only sound was the distant creek and the night wind moving through dry grass. "Then we file the petition and we don't withdraw," she said. "That's the answer." "That is the answer," he agreed. "And we watch." "I can watch," she said. He looked at her across the lamp and the ledgers and the evening quiet of the main house. He had a look sometimes, she had noticed, of a man who was saying something in his head that he was not saying out loud, and she suspected that this was one of those moments. "I know you can," he said. The petition was filed in early October, 9 days after the auction. Abernathy drafted it. Sarah read every word of the draft and corrected 2 errors of fact and 1 of law, and Abernathy accepted the corrections with the slightly pained graciousness of a competent man who has just been corrected by a woman and is making his peace with it. The petition alleged forgery of the original debt instrument, cited the discrepancy in handwriting evidence, and requested restoration of the Lockhart parcel to Sarah Lockhart as sole heir. Meridian's lawyers in Wichita received notice within the week. Their response, filed 11 days later, was 40 pages long and alleged nothing, but implied everything. It questioned the validity of Sarah's inheritance claim on the grounds of an alleged second claimant, a name she had never heard, one Jasper Lockhart, purportedly a cousin of her father's from Missouri. She read the response in Abernathy's office with Silas standing beside her, and she felt the anger she had been keeping clean and useful begin to shade into something else, something exhausted and frightened, because this was new information, and new information in a legal proceeding meant new complications and new costs and new time. "Jasper Lockhart," she said. "My father never mentioned a cousin named Jasper." "That may be deliberate on Meridian's part," Silas said. "A disputed inheritance creates standing issues that can delay the petition indefinitely. Can we prove this Jasper Lockhart doesn't exist?" "We can try," Abernathy said. "I'll write to the Missouri Territorial Records Office. But it will take time." She put the response down on Abernathy's desk and went to the window and looked at Providence Street and thought about her father's hidden past, the dark past that she apparently did not fully know, the secrets that Meridian's lawyers were willing to invent if necessary, and she felt more alone in that moment than she had felt since the morning of the auction. She had been told her whole life that the world was a fair place if you worked hard enough and kept your accounts straight, and she had always known at some level that this was not entirely true. But the gap between knowing a thing intellectually and experiencing it materially was wider than she had estimated. Silas came to stand beside her at the window, not close, not touching, just present, which was the thing he did when she needed it and which she was not sure he was conscious of doing. "We're not done," he said quietly. "They're stalling. Stalling means they're worried." "They could stall for a year," she said. "They could," he agreed. "But Dr. Calvert's analysis will come before the year is out, and a documented forgery changes everything regardless of the inheritance question." She turned from the window and made herself think in straight lines again. She was good at straight lines. It was the thing she had in common with the man standing beside her, she thought, the preference for clear thinking over emotional navigation, and the irony that this preference did not actually protect you from feeling things. "Then we wait for Calvert," she said. "Then we wait for Calvert," he agreed. They rode back to the doubly in the afternoon, and Sarah noticed that the quality of the silence between them had changed since the summer. In the first weeks it had been the silence of strangers navigating uncertain territory. It had become something warmer and more settled, a silence that did not need to be filled, that had its own comfort. She noticed it the way you notice weather, not with great deliberateness but with the body's constant background attention. October deepened and the prairie moved toward winter with the particular swift efficiency of the high Kansas plains. The grass went gold and then brown, and the cottonwoods along Sweetwater Creek dropped their leaves in a sudden bright week that she watched from the cottage's west window with her morning coffee in both hands. The cattle on the doubly grew their winter coats and moved differently in the cold air, more compact, more purposeful. The ranch routine shifted around the season, less time on the far pasture, more time reinforcing the windbreaks, laying in feed. She worked on the accounts every day. She had reorganized the entire year's records by the end of her third week and had begun a new system for the following year that would let Silas see his operating costs against projected income at a glance, which no rancher she had ever known actually had, but which seemed to her an obvious thing to want. She explained the system to him one evening by lamplight, and watched him follow the logic of it with the focused attention of a man who learns quickly and does not pretend to understand things he doesn't. "This column," he said, pointing to one she'd labeled seasonal variance. "You're accounting for the fact that feed costs in January are higher than in June." "Because they are," she said. "Your June estimates keep coming out low because you're projecting a flat monthly feed cost. If you build the seasonal variance in at the start, the projections are accurate." "I've been undercounting January by about 30% for 6 years," he said. "Closer to 28%, she said, "based on your records." He shook his head slowly, not with frustration but with something more like wonder. "Where did you learn this?" "My father," she said, "and the books he ordered. And a lot of time alone with numbers because there wasn't much else to do on 160 acres in the winter." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have been in a university," he said, and he said it plainly, without the slightly uncomfortable edge that most men put on the concept of a woman in a university, as if they were making a concession. He said it the way you'd say the sky is wide, a simple acknowledgement of a fact. She felt something move through her that was warm and uncomfortable, and that she recognized, with some dismay, as the beginning of a feeling she had not planned for. There weren't many universities interested in young women from Kansas homesteads in 1879, she said, keeping her voice even. "No," he said. "That's the injustice of it." She looked at him. He was looking at the ledger, tracing the seasonal variance column with one finger, and his expression was genuinely troubled, not on her behalf specifically, but on behalf of the general principle. A man whose sense of fairness was wide enough to include things that did not directly affect him. She picked up her pencil and went back to the accounts and did not say anything more. But the warm, uncomfortable thing did not go away. It was in the second week of October that the thing she had been watching for happened. She came back to the cottage from Caldwell late one afternoon and found the door standing open. Not broken, not forced, just open. She stopped her horse outside and looked at it for a moment, and then she tied the horse to the post and went inside carefully, and found that nothing had been taken but that her papers, the copies of the debt instrument, her account books from the homestead, the letters she was preparing for Calvert, had been gone through. They had been put back, but not perfectly, and she knew their order too well not to see the difference. She went immediately to the main house. Silas was at the table with Tom Cossey, going over the week's work roster, and he looked up when she came in, and his expression changed instantly because her face must have been telling him something. "What happened?" he said, standing. She told him. He listened without interrupting, and then he looked at Tom Cossey and said, "Ride to the east gate and check the ground. Tell me if there were recent horses." Tom Cossey went without a word. "They were looking for something," Silas said after Tom left. "They were looking to see what evidence I have assembled," she said. "They want to know how strong our case is. Or they were looking to take something that weakens it." "Everything critical is with Abernathy or already sent to Calvert," she said. "I don't keep originals here, I made copies." He looked at her with that expression again, the one that was updating its assessment. "You expected this," he said. "I planned for the possibility," she said. "It seemed prudent." Tom Cossey came back with the information that there had been 2 horses, shod and recently through, along the east fence line, a route that bypassed the main road. Silas sent another hand to ride to Caldwell and inform the county sheriff, a man named Beaumont who was competent and not in Meridian's pocket, which was not something you could say about every law officer in the territory. Sheriff Beaumont came out the next morning, took notes, looked at the disturbed ground at the east fence, and said he would make inquiries. He looked at Sarah with the particular expression of a man who is privately surprised that she is holding herself together this well, and has not yet adjusted his expectation to accommodate the reality of what she is. "I want to know who authorized that land auction proceeding," she told Beaumont. "Specifically who filed the motion to advance the date by 2 days. That wasn't Meridian's Wichita lawyers. Someone local made that call." Beaumont looked at her. Then he looked at Silas. Then he looked at his notebook and wrote something down. "I'll look into it," he said. After he left, Silas stood on the porch of the main house and looked out over the north pasture where the cattle were moving in the thin October sunlight and said, "You know who it was." "I have a strong suspicion," she said. "Purvis moved the auction date. Purvis was cooperative with your technical argument yesterday in a way that suggested he was looking for an exit. He knew it was vulnerable." "Purvis is local counsel for the Meridian Group," Silas said. "He filed for them on the Hennessy property seizure." She absorbed this. "Then he is both the court officer and their local representative, which is a direct conflict that should disqualify every proceeding he's presided over in their interest." "Yes," Silas said, "and Beaumont knows it." "Then Beaumont's inquiries may accomplish more than I thought," she said. They stood on the porch together in the cool morning air, and the moment had a quality of shared effort that she was beginning to depend on more than she wanted to admit. The particular ease of working alongside someone whose mind moved at a compatible speed, who did not need things explained twice, and did not explain things to you that you already knew. She thought about the forgery. She thought about the father she had known, the careful, honest man who had kept perfect accounts and paid cash for everything, and taught her to read ledgers before she could read novels. She thought about the 8 years ago when this supposed loan had been taken, when she had been 18, when her mother had already been 2 years dead, and the homestead had been hard, and her father had been working long days with diminishing health, when he might have been vulnerable in a way she had not registered as a child present in the situation. She thought about whether someone had approached him, whether there had been a real conversation that had been twisted into a forged instrument afterward, whether the dark past her father had carried was not a secret he had chosen, but one that had been constructed around him without his knowledge. The grief of this possibility was specific and terrible, and she let herself feel it briefly, and then set it aside. Dr. Calvert's analysis arrived on the 17th of October. Abernathy read it first and then brought it to her at the doubly, because she had asked him to, and because by then Abernathy had adjusted his expectations enough to understand that she would want to read it herself before he summarized it. She sat at the main house table with Silas and Abernathy and read it. Dr. George Calvert, document examiner, with 15 years of practice and experience in 7 territorial court proceedings, was of the professional opinion, expressed with a confidence level he described as high, that the signature on the debt instrument was not written by the same hand as the samples provided. He cited 12 specific points of comparison: the low-crossed T, the double-looped capital L, the particular angle of the signature's baseline, among others. He concluded that the instrument bore a competent forgery of Franklin Thomas Lockhart's signature. She read it twice. The second time her hands were steadier than the first time, which was the opposite of what she expected. The anger, the clean and useful anger, was back. "File the amended petition," she said to Abernathy. "Today." "Today is a Thursday," Abernathy said. "The court clerk's office. I'll ride to Wichita myself if the Caldwell clerk won't take it today," she said. Abernathy looked at her over his cracked lens. Then he looked at Silas, who was watching Sarah with an expression Abernathy had not seen on Silas Ellsworth's face before, and which he filed quietly away in the category of things that were not his business. "I'll file it today," Abernathy said. The amended petition, supported by Calvert's analysis, was filed before the Caldwell courthouse closed on the 17th of October. Meridian's Wichita lawyers received notice 2 days later. Their response to the amended petition was delayed, which Abernathy said was significant because they had responded to everything else within 11 days. The delay suggested internal deliberation. The delay suggested that Calvert's analysis had reached the part of their calculation where the cost of continuing began to exceed the value of the prize. In the meantime, Beaumont had been quietly investigating Purvis, and on the 22nd of October he came to the doubly with the information that Purvis had indeed filed as local agent for the Meridian Group on 3 previous land proceedings in Caldwell County, all 3 of which he had also officiated as court officer, which was a conflict of interest significant enough to call every one of those proceedings into question. He was also investigating the fire that had destroyed a barn belonging to the Hennessy family 3 months earlier. The world was beginning, slowly, to reorganize itself into something that looked like accountability. Sarah watched it happening, and she helped it happen, and she went about her days on the doubly with the particular focused energy of a person who has decided what they are fighting for, and has committed to fighting for it without drama, just the daily, disciplined, accumulative work of making a case. And alongside this work, something else was happening, something quieter and more insistent, that lived in the evenings after the accounts were done, and the lamp was between them, and the conversation moved away from petitions and handwriting experts and territorial statutes, and toward other territory. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Ohio 7 years ago, after the death of his parents in quick succession, his father first and then his mother 6 months later, and that he had taken the inheritance, which was modest, and come west with the particular combination of grief and ambition that she understood from her own experience as the primary fuel of Western migration. He had started with 30 head of cattle and a parcel of land that had been designated as undesirable scrubland by the previous owner, and had turned it into the doubly by the application of systematic effort and a willingness to rethink things that other ranchers treated as fixed. She learned that he had been engaged once, 4 years ago, to a woman named Clara who had come from Ohio at his invitation and spent 3 months on the doubly and decided, with complete rationality and no particular blame on either side, that she was not suited for this life, and had gone back east and married a banker in Columbus, and that he did not speak of this with bitterness, but with the honest assessment of a man who has accepted an outcome he did not choose and moved forward. She learned that he kept the 3 books in the cottage because he had put them there for his own use when he was using the cottage during a month when the main house was being re-roofed, and that he had simply forgotten to take them back, which meant the shelf in the cottage was not a deliberate comfort offered to a guest, but an accident, which for some reason she found more touching than the deliberate version. He learned things about her too. He learned about her mother, who had been a school teacher from Virginia, and who had brought mathematics books and Latin grammar to the Kansas frontier and taught her daughter with complete seriousness. He learned about the 3 years of her father's declining health, when she had managed the homestead alone while nursing him, the weight of that, the love and the exhaustion of it. He learned that she read whatever she could find, and that she had strong opinions about what she read and was unafraid to say so. He learned that she was precise with language in the way of someone for whom words have been important tools rather than social decorations, and that she found imprecision in speech slightly annoying, which made him more careful with his own words in her presence, which she noticed, and which had an effect she was not entirely prepared for. November arrived, and with it the first hard frosts and the particular beauty of the plains in early winter, the grass silver in the morning, the sky a hard clear blue, the creek running dark and quick between ice-edged banks. She developed a habit of walking to the creek in the early afternoon, between the accounting work and the evening review session, because the creek was the one thing that belonged to both her life and this one. The same water that ran behind her homestead ran behind the Doubly's eastern pasture, and standing beside it she felt both displaced and connected. He found her there one afternoon in early November and stood beside her without announcing himself, which was something he had never done before, always having announced himself with the sound of his footfall or a word, and the sudden sense of his presence at her shoulder was startling enough that she turned quickly, and the startlement showed on her face before she could prevent it. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. I didn't mean to come on you quiet." "It's all right," she said. Her heart was doing something she was going to require it to stop doing. They stood together at the creek's edge, and the water moved past them carrying leaves and the occasional small ice skim and making its winter sounds, lower and faster than summer. "Calvert's testimony has been scheduled," he said. The court set the hearing date for December the 4th, she calculated. That's 6 weeks. Yes. And Meridian's lawyers are still representing. They are. But Beaumont's report on Purvis was submitted to the Territorial District Court this week. The Purvis conflict of interest issue is now formally under review. If the district court upholds it, the original seizure proceeding is void regardless of what happens with the forgery case. She felt something shift in her chest, a loosening, the particular physical sensation of a knot releasing that she had not been fully aware of being there. That changes the calculation significantly, she said. It does, he agreed. Abernathy thinks Meridian may seek a settlement before the hearing. What kind of settlement? Restoration of the land in exchange for withdrawal of the forgery case against the debt instrument. Why would I want that? She said. If the forgery case succeeds, every debt instrument they've filed in this county using the same method becomes questionable. The Hennessy land, the other 2 Purvis properties. A settlement that includes withdrawal protects them from that. He was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this more than Abernathy has, he said. The Hennessy family lost their barn, she said. Someone needs to think about it. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, and she felt that attention the way you feel sun in the cold, as warmth that has direction and source. She made herself keep looking at the creek. Sarah, he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without her title, and the sound of it in his voice was something she was going to need to think about later when she was alone, and could be properly unreasonable about it. Yes, she said carefully. I want to tell you something, he said, and I want to be direct about it because I find that I am not good at anything else. She waited. I came to that auction in September because of the water rights and because of the Meridian Group, he said. Those were my reasons. They were honest reasons, but they were not the only reason I stayed, and they are not the reason he stopped. The creek ran past them. I am aware, she said very quietly, that what you're about to say involves a power imbalance that makes it complicated. I know, he said. You are living on my land and working for my accounts and fighting a legal case that I am partly financing. I am aware of what that looks like, and I am aware of how it could be used by someone less honest to create an obligation. I want you to know that I am not doing that. I have never intended to do that. If you tell me that what I'm about to say is unwelcome or premature or makes your situation here more uncomfortable, I will hear that and I will not speak of it again, and nothing about the practical arrangement changes. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the creekwater eyes and the careful, direct expression that was not performing anything. Say it, she said. I have found myself looking forward to every evening, he said, to the accounts and the lamp and the conversation. I have found myself thinking during the day about things I want to tell you that evening, arguments and observations and things I read in the newspaper that I want to know your opinion of. I have found that the particular quality of your mind is something I have not encountered before, and that I am better at thinking in the evenings after we have talked than I am in the mornings before. And I am aware that this is a rather pedestrian way of arriving at something that is not pedestrian at all, but I am telling you because I believe in telling the truth, and I believe you deserve the truth rather than a performance of it. The creek made its winter sounds. The cold air moved over them. I have been telling myself, she said carefully, that what I am feeling is gratitude. And he said, and I don't think it is entirely gratitude, she said. The silence between them was the warm kind. He did not move toward her. He stood beside her at the creek's edge and let the moment be what it was, which was an acknowledgement and a beginning, not a conclusion, and she was grateful for this because she was not a woman who made conclusions at creeksides in November 6 weeks before a court hearing. Then after December 4th, he said, when this is settled. After December 4th, she agreed. They walked back to the ranch together in the early evening cold, and the conversation shifted easily to the week's logistics, the feed inventory and the winter preparation, and the letter she needed to write to Calvert about his travel arrangements for the hearing. And this ease, the ability to move from one thing to another without awkwardness, was itself a kind of declaration that she let herself feel fully as she walked. The next 6 weeks were dense with activity. Abernathy received an inquiry from Meridian's lawyers about a possible settlement, framed exactly as Silas had predicted: land restoration in exchange for forgery case withdrawal. Sarah dictated her response to Abernathy, and he wrote it down with the expression of a man who is taking notes from a commanding officer. Her response declined the settlement and proposed a counter: restoration of the Lockhart parcel, plus restoration of the Hennessy parcel, plus Meridian's withdrawal from all 3 Caldwell County land proceedings, plus a sworn statement acknowledging the invalidity of the original debt instrument, in exchange for her agreement not to pursue civil damages. She gave them 10 days to respond. They did not respond within 10 days. They responded within 6, and they agreed to her counter with the modification that the statement would not use the word forgery, using instead the phrase instrument found to be defective. She consulted with Silas and Abernathy for approximately 20 minutes, and then accepted this modification on the grounds that the legal effect was identical, and the semantic difference was not worth the additional months of litigation. The settlement agreement was signed on the 28th of November. The Lockhart parcel was officially restored to Sarah Lockhart on the 1st of December, 1879, in a brief and almost anticlimactic proceeding before the Caldwell County Court, with a different officer presiding, because Purvis had resigned his position the previous week amid the district court's investigation. She stood on the steps of the courthouse afterward with Abernathy and Silas, and the sun was cold and bright, and the streets smelled of wood smoke, and she held the restoration document in her hands and looked at it for a long moment. "Well," she said. Abernathy cleared his throat. "The Hennessy restoration will take another 2 weeks, but it is, at this point, a formality." He looked at her over his cracked lens with the expression he had developed over the preceding months, the one that acknowledged without quite articulating that she had been the driving intelligence of this entire proceeding. "Miss Lockhart," he said, "it has been an education." "For me as well," she said. He tipped his hat and walked down the courthouse steps and away down Providence Street, and she and Silas were left standing in the December sun, and the whole situation was resolved, and the threat was removed, and she had her land back, and she was 26 years old, and the man standing beside her was waiting with the patience of someone who has promised to wait and intends to keep the promise. She looked at him. "December 4th, she said, which was 3 days away. "I had not forgotten," he said. "Neither had I," she said, "but I wanted to say it because I want to be clear." "I have noticed," he said with the smallest possible version of a smile, "that you prefer to be clear." "I find that clarity prevents a great many subsequent complications," she said. "So do I," he said. "Let me be clear then. I would like to court you properly, with your full knowledge and your full choice in the matter. I would like to have every evening I can have with you, and I would like there to be more years of evenings ahead of us. And I would like, eventually, to ask you a more specific question, but I will not ask it today because you have just this morning won a land case, and you deserve to hold that on its own for a while." She looked at the restoration document in her hands, and then at him, and then at the December street. 3 days, she said. "I'll give you an answer to the courtship question in 3 days, on December 4th. He nodded, which was all he said, and they walked down the courthouse steps together. She rode to the homestead that afternoon alone. She needed to see it with the deed in her hand and the knowledge that it was hers, not borrowed, not contested, but hers. The garden was bare and winter-ready in the way gardens are when they have been left to their own seasonal wisdom, which is different from abandonment. The house was cold inside but structurally sound, and the kitchen window faced east, and the afternoon light came through it slanted and golden the way it always had. She walked through every room and felt her father's presence in them, not as grief exactly, but as a weight of continuity, the sense of a life that had been lived in these walls with integrity and care, and that had been targeted precisely because of that integrity. Because the Meridian Group had looked for quiet landowners who kept to themselves and trusted the world to be fair, and her father had been one of those people. And she felt the anger and the love together, and let them exist together without trying to resolve one into the other. She came back to the doubly at dusk and found Mrs. Delacroix making supper with the particular elaborate attention she brought to everything she cooked, which was spectacular, and Tom Cossey was at the corral and two of the other hands. A quiet man from Texas named Rios and a red-haired young man named Bartlett were finishing the evening feed, and the ranch had its particular dusk-time quality of settling into itself, all its moving parts finding their places for the night. Silas was at the gate of the main house yard, and he turned when he heard her horse and looked at her with the direct expression that had come to mean home to her in a way she had not planned and was not going to pretend she had not noticed. "How was it?" he said. "It's mine," she said. "It felt like mine." "Good," he said. They had supper with Mrs. Delacroix's excellent cooking, and the conversation that evening was lighter than it had been in weeks, untethered from legal strategy and timelines, wandering through books and the winter plans for the ranch and a letter Silas had received from his sister in Ohio, and the particular opinion Sarah had developed about the account system she had built and where it could be improved in the new year. The lamp burned between them and the house was warm, and outside the Kansas winter was making itself known in the wind against the windows, and she thought about the cottage with its west-facing window, and the 3 books on the shelf and the wood stove, and she thought about how small a space can become something enormous when the right kind of life is lived in it. December 4th arrived. A Sunday, gray and cold, with the suggestion of snow by evening. She spent the morning at the homestead, beginning the work of winter preparation in earnest, rehanging the kitchen door which had come loose on its top hinge, checking the water in the well, going over the structure of the barn which would need repair come spring. The physical work was satisfying in the specific way of things done for a place that belongs to you and that you intend to keep. She rode back to the doubly at midday and found Silas at the main house porch, sitting on the porch step in the cold, which was unusual enough that she stopped her horse and looked at him. "You are sitting on the porch step in December," she said. "I am," he agreed. "Why?" "I was waiting," he said. The inside of the house was too. He paused. "I needed the cold air." She tied her horse and came up to the porch and sat beside him on the step, which was cold through her coat, and looked out over the north pasture where the cattle were standing in their winter compact groups. "You said 3 days," he said. "I did," she said. "I have an answer." He waited. "Yes," she said, "to the courtship question." He let out a breath that had a quality of something long held releasing. She felt it more than heard it. "And to the more specific question," she said, because she was a woman who preferred clarity. "The one you said you weren't going to ask today. I'm telling you now that when you do ask it, my answer to that is also yes, so that you know, so you're not carrying uncertainty longer than necessary." He turned to look at her, and the December light was flat and gray and cold, and his face in it was completely open, the careful directness that she had come to love. She allowed herself the word now, stripped of everything but the simple and enormous feeling underneath it. "Sarah," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached over and took her hand, which was gloved against the cold, and he held it with both of his, and they sat on the porch step in the December morning, and the snow that had been suggesting itself since dawn began to fall, first in isolated flakes and then in the soft, determined way of a real snow that intends to stay. "I had planned something more ceremonial," he said after a while. "I prefer this," she said. "The porch step in the snow." "The porch step in the snow," she confirmed. He raised her gloved hand and pressed it briefly against his jaw, and the gesture was so quiet and so intimate that she felt it from her hand to her sternum, and she turned and leaned her shoulder against his, and they watched the snow come down on the doubly's north pasture, and the cattle and the creek and the bare cottonwoods, and the entire visible world going white and quiet and new. He asked the formal question on Christmas Day. He had been saving the ring, which had been his mother's, a small opal set in gold, and he asked it in the main house with Mrs. Delacroix in the kitchen making entirely too much food, and Tom Causey and Rios and Bartlett in the bunkhouse having their own holiday. And she said yes without hesitation. And he put the ring on her finger, and they stood in the front room of the main house in the December light. And she looked at his face and felt the kind of certainty that is not a feeling but a knowledge, bedded down deep, unshakable, the thing you know rather than the thing you hope. They were married in February on a Saturday that was unexpectedly warm, the kind of day the Kansas winter produces occasionally as a reminder that spring exists, when the temperature lifted into the 50s, and the sun was genuine, and the mud in the main street of Caldwell was honest spring mud. And the small party gathered at the Caldwell church included Abernathy with his cracked spectacles, and Sheriff Beaumont and Tom Causey and Rios and Bartlett and Mrs. Delacroix, who cried freely and without apology, and a handful of neighbors from the surrounding ranches who had heard the story, parts of it at least, and who came with the goodwill of people living on a frontier who understand that the strength of those around them is relevant to their own survival. The Reverend was a man named Hooper who was known for efficiency, which Sarah had specifically requested, and he was efficient, and they were married in 11 minutes, which was 11 minutes of her full attention and complete presence, nothing blurred or ceremonial automatic, the words clear and the meaning of them fully felt. Silas said his vows with the directness he brought to everything, looking at her and not at his hands or the Reverend or the middle distance, and she said hers the same way, because she had always believed that words meant something, and that you should say them looking at the person therefore. They had a dinner at the Doubly that Mrs. Delacroix had been preparing for 3 days and which was extraordinary, and the evening was loud and warm and full of the particular generosity of people who are glad to have something to celebrate. And Sarah sat at the table in the house that was now hers as well as his, and felt the fullness of it without qualification. The spring that followed was one of the best working seasons the Doubly had seen. Sarah's account system proved its value in the first quarter's calculations. The operating costs came in within 2% of projection, which Silas called remarkable, and which she called the expected result of accurate modeling. She had taken on the full management of the Doubly's financial records, while keeping the Lockhart homestead functioning as a secondary operation, running 20 head of cattle on the Sweetwater land with Tom Causey's help, and 2 hands of her own hiring, a decision she had made because she had no intention of letting the homestead sit idle, and because the creek's water rights were both properties' concern. The Hennessy family got their land back in January, as Abernathy had predicted, and the Hennessy patriarch, a large quiet man named Edmund, came to the Doubly in February specifically to thank Sarah, having heard that she had insisted on including his land in the settlement terms. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and said what he needed to say in the direct way of a man who is not accustomed to being rescued and has made his peace with it. And she said what she needed to say in return, which was that it was the right thing to do and not a favor, and they shook hands on that distinction. The district court completed its investigation of Purvis in March, and he was stripped of his position and referred for prosecution. The Meridian Group, under the pressure of the Purvis investigation and the threat of further scrutiny, quietly withdrew from Caldwell County entirely, their remaining land holdings in the area liquidated, and the proceeds distributed to the former owners under a court-supervised settlement that Abernathy managed with considerable competence, and a new pair of spectacles, both lenses intact, purchased from the fees his work on the Lockhart case had generated. In April, Sarah told Silas that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table of the main house, with the east-facing window filling with the early April light that was beginning to have real warmth in it for the first time since October. She watched his face process the information, the slight stillness, the reordering, and then the expression that came after, which was not performed happiness but the real kind, the kind that lands in the body before it reaches the face. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Are you well?" He said, "Are you feeling?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm very well." He looked at their hands on the table for a moment, and then he looked at her, and the vulnerability in his expression, the openness of a man who has spent most of his adult life being competently self-contained and has found something that breaches that containment without warning, moved through her like water. "Good," he said, which was not an adequate word but was the right one, the one that carried everything. The summer of 1880 was long and productive and full. Sarah continued managing both the Doubleys' accounts and the homestead operation, though she hired a second hand for the homestead crew as the pregnancy progressed, and she became less inclined toward extended horseback rides. Mrs. Delacroix developed strong opinions about her diet, and acted on them with a Creole cook's conviction that no problem was not addressable by correct application of food, which was not always accurate but was never unwelcome. Silas was present in the particular way that a man is present when he has decided that presence is the most important thing he can offer, showing up at the account table in the evenings even when he was tired, riding with her on short circuits of the property in the late afternoon when the summer light went golden and long, asking her opinion about things because he wanted it and making visible use of it when she gave it. She thought sometimes about the courthouse yard in September, about standing in her green wool dress with her hand on the fence post, and the gavel coming down and the crowd's flat assessing eyes, and she thought about the particular geometry of betrayal, how it requires trust to function, and her father had trusted a system that had been corrupted around him without his knowledge, and she had trusted the world to maintain a basic fairness that it had not maintained. And both of those trusts had been violated by the specific dark design of men who treated land and people as interchangeable instruments of financial extraction. And then she thought about what had come from that violation, which was not a diminishment of the capacity for trust but a refinement of it, a clearer understanding of where to place it and how to evaluate it. And she thought about the gray-green eyes and the direct voice and the held hand on the cold porch step. And she decided that the arithmetic of the whole experience was not a simple subtraction, but something more complicated. Something that had taken loss and built from it something that she would not exchange. The baby was born in October, a boy, which she had suspected for reasons she could not have explained medically but which turned out to be correct. He was born on a Tuesday morning with a midwife named Mrs. Crandall in attendance and Silas in the main house, which was where she had sent him because she was a practical woman, and she knew that the men who waited in the room were a category of complication she did not need, and Mrs. Crandall was excellent, and the morning was long but not frightening, and at the end of it, there was a boy with a considerable amount of dark hair and a loud opinion about the world. Silas came in when she called for him and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time with the careful, concentrated attention of a man receiving something of extraordinary value and making absolutely certain he is doing it correctly. "Franklin," she said, "if you agree." He looked up from the baby's face to hers. "Franklin," he said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard before, new registers of it, and she thought about her father and the forged signature and the cleared debt, and the morning light through the kitchen window, and the continuity of names carrying the weight of the people who bore them. "Franklin," he said again, and looked back down at the baby, who had closed his eyes with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who has accomplished what he came to do and intends to rest. Life settled into the particular richness of days that are full of ordinary things made significant by who you share them with. Franklin, called Frank almost immediately by everyone on the ranch, was a sturdy and observant child who watched the world from his mother's arms with eyes that were initially indeterminate, but settled within his first weeks into the same gray-green as his father's, which Tom Cossey noted with undisguised delight at every opportunity. He was a ranch child from his first months, accustomed to the sounds and smells of a working operation, unhurried by cattle or horses, taking the frontier's constant motion as simply the normal texture of existence. Sarah was back at the accounts within 2 weeks of the birth, Frank in a cradle beside the table, which she considered a reasonable arrangement, and which Silas accepted without the useless argument that she would have managed to lose patience with. She had modified the account system again over the winter, incorporating the homestead's numbers into the Doubly's overall financial picture as a subsidiary operation, which made the combined picture cleaner and revealed 2 operating efficiencies they had not previously identified, one in the spring cattle purchase cycle and one in the winter feed procurement. She showed him the efficiencies on a February evening when Frank was asleep, and the lamp was between them and the window showed a clear, cold night full of stars. "This one," she said, pointing to the feed procurement line. "We're buying in October at peak autumn prices. If we contracted in July before the autumn demand rises, we'd save approximately 12% annually." He studied the figures. "The capital has to be available in July to make the contract. The second quarter cattle sale generates enough," she said. "By my projection, yes, you can see it here." He followed her finger across the page. 12%, he said. "Approximately. It could be as high as 15 in a good market year." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the figures. "I want to know what you want," he said, not about the accounts, and she recognized the shift in his voice. She looked up from the ledger. "The homestead," he said. "Your plans for it." "I want to know what you see, not what makes sense for the Doubly, what you want for yourself." She sat with this for a moment. She had been thinking about it without bringing it to the table yet. "I want to expand it," she said. 20 head is not the limit of what that land can support. The soil along the creek is excellent. I want to try some cropping on the east section, not for commercial sale initially, for self-sufficiency. I want to hire a third hand for it by next spring. I want it to be a productive operation in its own right, not just an adjunct." He was listening with the full attention she had come to rely on. "I want it to be Frank's one day," she said, "if he wants it. The Lockhart land, his grandfather's land. I don't want it to just dissolve into the Doubly's acreage over time. I want it to keep its own identity." He nodded slowly. "Then we run them as parallel operations with shared accounting. The Doubly and the Lockhart parcel, separate identities, combined oversight." "Yes," she said, "that's what I want." "Then that's what we do," he said simply. She looked at him across the lamp and the ledger and the quiet house, and felt the particular quality of love that is different from the beginning kind, the kind that has been tested by real things and found reliable, the kind that has watched someone make decisions under pressure and understood from those decisions who they are, the kind that includes the knowledge that this person will not perform understanding of your choices, but will actually make them possible. And that is different from the beginning kind in that it is not a discovery but a confirmation, daily and ongoing and solid as the high plains ground. In the spring of 1882, there was a second child, a daughter they named Alina, for Sarah's mother, and Frank was 18 months old and deeply suspicious of her for approximately 4 days before concluding that she was acceptable and beginning to demonstrate the protective instinct that would be a defining feature of his character throughout his life. Alina was fair-haired and loud, and had opinions from her first weeks that were impossible to misinterpret. Mrs. Delacroix said she had the personality of a woman who was going to run something one day, which was the highest compliment Mrs. Delacroix knew how to give, and which everyone accepted in the spirit it was offered. The Lockhart parcel's expansion had proceeded well in the 2 years since Sarah's decision to grow it. She had the third hand, a reliable man named Garrett who had come from a failed homestead in Nebraska and knew good soil management, and the cropping trial on the east section had been encouraging in its first year and excellent in its second. The accounting for both operations was clean and current, and showed a combined financial picture that Abernathy, who still handled legal matters for both properties and whose new spectacles remained intact, described as exceptionally sound. Silas had in 1881 negotiated a water rights agreement with the remaining properties along Sweetwater Creek, a formal compact that distributed access fairly and that Sarah had drafted the language for, working with Abernathy on the legal precision, because she had decided that if the water question was going to be settled, it was going to be settled for all the neighboring properties, not just the doubly, and that the Meridian Group's primary weapon had been the exploitation of insecure water rights, and that security should be the outcome. The compact was signed by 5 property owners on a June afternoon in the Caldwell Courthouse, a different occasion than the one in September 1879, a different kind of gavel coming down, and she sat in the courtroom beside Silas and held Frank on her lap and watched the signatures go onto the document one by one, and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing completed correctly. Edmund Hennessy was among the signatories. He signed his name with a large, careful hand and looked across the table at Sarah before he lifted his pen and said, without particular ceremony, "This would not exist without you." And she said, "It exists because all of us needed it," which was both true and her way of distributing the credit properly, because the collective survival of the creek's downstream families was the actual achievement, not any single person's intelligence or effort. On the ride home from Caldwell that evening, Frank asleep against her shoulder and the Kansas summer evening going gold and long around them, Silas rode beside her at the easy pace they used for long distances, and the silence between them was the fully comfortable kind that has no edges in it. "What are you thinking?" he said after a while. "About my father," she said. "About what he would have thought of today." Silas was quiet for a moment. "A man who paid cash for seed," he said. "I think he would have approved of a document that makes the water secure. He would have read every word of it twice," she said. "So did you," he said. "I did," she agreed. The evening light moved over the prairie grass, and the creek ran alongside the road for a quarter-mile, and then bent away north. And Frank shifted in her arms and made a small sound and settled again. And she looked at the man riding beside her and felt the years of it, the weight and the warmth of accumulated time, the way a life built with someone becomes architectural, a structure you live inside without always being aware of the load it bears. He looked over at her, and his expression in the evening light was the open one, the one that had no careful distance in it, and he said, "I am very glad I went to that auction." "For the water rights," she said. "For the water rights," he agreed, and the warmth in his voice made the words mean everything. By the autumn of 1882, Sarah Lockhart Ellsworth was 29 years old and managing the combined accounts of a 600-head cattle ranch, a secondary livestock and cropping operation of growing productivity, and a household that included 2 children under 3, and she was doing this at a standard of efficiency that made the doubly one of the better-run operations in Caldwell County, which was information that circulated through the county's social structure in the particular way that such information circulates about women, which is to say quietly, with occasional surprise, and with an increasing acceptance among the people who worked alongside her that the surprise was the unexamined assumptions problem, not the facts. She had become, without exactly planning to, a figure of some consequence in the county's land affairs. 3 families came to her in that autumn alone for advice about debt instruments and land covenants, having heard about the Lockhart case through the kinds of channels that carry useful information on the frontier, neighbor to neighbor and season to season. She consulted with them at the Doubleys' kitchen table and read their documents, and explained what she understood and directed them to Abernathy when the situation required legal action. And she did not charge for this, because it seemed to her that the most important thing the Lockhart case had taught her was that isolated vulnerability was what the Meridian groups of the world counted on, and that knowledge shared was the most effective prevention. In the late autumn, Silas found her one evening at the desk she had moved into the main house's front room, Frank and Alina asleep and the house quiet, surrounded by documents that were not the Doubleys' Peterson family, he said, reading the name on the top document. Their deed covenant has a reversionary clause that their grantor's estate is trying to activate, she said. The clause is probably unenforceable under current territorial law, but they need Abernathy to confirm it. He looked at the documents and then at her. You are running a land advisory practice in our front room, he said. I'm helping our neighbors understand their legal situation, she said. At no charge. At no charge. He looked at her for a moment. What if you charged, he said. Not a fee for consultation, a formal practice. You read and analyze land instruments, you identify issues, you work with Abernathy on the legal framing. The frontier needs this. There are people losing land every season because they can't afford a Wichita lawyer and they don't know what to look for. She put down her pen and considered this. A woman practicing land instrument analysis in Kansas in 1882, she said. A woman who has already done it in several cases with documented successful outcomes, he said, including one that involved the district court and a Wichita law firm. Abernathy might object to the competition. Abernathy might become your partner, Silas said. He does the court work. You do the document analysis and case strategy. His credibility in court, your analytical capacity. It seems to me that is a combination that wins cases. She looked at him. He was absolutely serious. You have been thinking about this, she said. Since spring, he said. Why didn't you say so in spring? Because it was your idea to have, he said. I was waiting for you to see it yourself. She looked at the Peterson family's documents and at the desk in the front room that had become her natural habitat, and at the man standing in the doorway of the front room in the lamplight with his coat still on from the evening rounds and the Creekwater eyes and the direct expression and the absolute conviction, never performed, always demonstrated, that her capacity was a fact to be used and not a surprise to be managed. I'll talk to Abernathy, she said. He'll say yes, Silas said. You don't know that, she said. I know he said his practice has tripled since the Lockhart case put Caldwell County's land issues on the district court's radar, Silas said. I know he needs someone who can handle the document analysis end because he is better in court than at a desk. And I know that when he had you in his office for 7 months, he watched you correct his documents and accepted the corrections. That is 3 pieces of circumstantial evidence, she said. All pointing in the same direction, he said. She looked at the desk. She looked at the Peterson documents. She thought about the auction in September 3 years past, and the gavel and the flat assessing eyes and the particular shape of the trap that had been laid. And she thought about all the people who did not have what she had now, the knowledge, the resources, the partner beside them. And she thought about what you do with the thing that tried to destroy you when it doesn't succeed. You learn it, she thought. You learn it well enough to prevent it from doing to others what it tried to do to you. All pointing in the same direction, she agreed. Abernathy did say yes. He said it within the first 8 minutes of their conversation in his office, before she had finished presenting the arrangement, and she was fairly certain he had been thinking about something like it himself, and was relieved not to have to propose it. They drew up an agreement in December, a formal partnership with clearly delineated responsibilities, Abernathy handling court appearances and Caldwell County's formal legal proceedings, Sarah managing document analysis, case research, and client consultation. The partnership was named Abernathy and Lockhart, which used her birth name by her specific choice, both for the professional reputation she had already established under it, and because she thought her father's name belonged on the door. She told Silas about the name choice that evening. Abernathy and Lockhart, he said. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a man processing something that has moved him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He would have been proud of that, he said, meaning her father. Yes, she said, I think he would have. They sat in the front room in the December evening with the lamp between them and Frank's and leaner sounds from the back bedroom, the settled sounds of sleeping children, and the fire in the wood stove, and the wind outside moving across the plains in the way it always moved, vast and indifferent to individual lives, but also somehow, on evenings like this one, not unkind. She had her land and her work and her name on a door, and a man beside her who had from the beginning asked her what she wanted and made room for the answers, and 2 children growing up on the Kansas frontier, with the creek running alongside the eastern pasture, and the cottonwoods dropping their leaves in the bright autumns, and the mornings going through the kitchen window in the particular gold of High Plains light that she had known her entire life, and intended to know for the rest of it. The partnership's first full year saw 14 cases, 9 of which were resolved in the client's favor without going to full court proceedings, which was the best possible outcome because it meant the families kept their land without the cost and time of litigation. 3 went to court, and 2 of those were won. 1 was lost on a genuine legal technicality that neither she nor Abernathy could overcome, and she visited that family after the decision and sat with them and explained every part of it and helped them understand their remaining options. Because that was the part of the work that was not about being right, but about being honest. And she had decided that honesty was the foundation on which everything else she intended to build would stand. In the spring of 1884, a 3rd child arrived, a 2nd son they named George, for no particular reason except that they both liked it. And Frank, now 4, greeted his 2nd sibling with a considered inspection, and the verdict that he was acceptable, and a leaner, not yet 2 and possessed of absolute confidence in her own authority, simply assumed management of the situation, which was accurate to who she was and would remain accurate for the rest of her life. Sarah stood at the kitchen window in April of 1884, with the morning light coming through it and George in her arms and the sounds of the ranch and the homestead both active and productive in the world outside. And she thought about all of it, the arc of the whole thing, from the gavel in the courthouse yard to here, this window, this morning, this life. She thought about the debt that had not existed, and the signature that had not been her father's, and the Meridian group that had counted on her isolated vulnerability, and the auctioneer and the crowd's flat eyes. She thought about how close the whole thing had come to going differently, how thin the margin had been between the life that was taken from her that September morning and the life she was standing in now. She thought about how much of the difference came down to a single moment, a single voice from behind her and to the right, steady and calm, saying a number that matched the full sum of the debt, not a bid but a solution. She thought about what he had asked her afterward, what you want to happen next. She had not known then, not precisely, not in the way she knew now, standing in the kitchen light with April pouring through the window and her son in her arms and the ranch and the homestead and the partnership and the compact and the evening hours at the lamp and the river water eyes and the open face. All of it assembled around her like the answer to a question she had been working toward her whole life without knowing it was a question. She heard his step on the porch, and the door opened, and he came in with the morning cold still on his coat, and looked at her at the window, and she turned to face him, and George was asleep against her shoulder, and the light was everywhere. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, and crossed the kitchen to where she stood and pressed his mouth to her temple with the ease of a man for whom tenderness has become as natural as breathing, and stood beside her at the window in the April light with his hand at the small of her back, and looked out at the land that was theirs and the creek and the cottonwoods coming back into leaf, and the sky so wide and clear it seemed like a declaration. The debt had been paid. The land had been restored. The name was on the door and the children were in the back rooms, and the accounts were balanced, and the water compact was signed, and the neighbors were safer, and the creek ran on, steadily, carrying snowmelt from the north down through the properties it had always sustained, indifferent to debt instruments and auction gavels, and the designs of land speculation companies, answering only to the simple hydraulic fact of water moving downhill toward the place it needs to be. She leaned her head slightly against his shoulder, and he leaned back, and George slept on, and the morning was entirely ordinary and entirely irreplaceable, which she had learned was the nature of the best things, the ones you do not recognize as precious while they are happening to you until you have lived long enough to know the weight of what you are holding. She was exactly where she wanted to be. She had been asked what she wanted next. This, all of this. The answer was this.